Joseph Redmount. He was 25 years old when he arrived in the U.S. with his 4 sisters. The name? A fabrication. The family traded the original, Oxyansov, for a translation of his mother's maiden name, Rotenberg. Roten to red, Berg to mount. Reasons for this change have been lost to the mythology of the family. For example, the idea that the name change occurred at Ellis Island because a clerk couldn't spell Oxyansov loses its credibility in light of available evidence. The Oxyansovs didn't come through Ellis Island, and according to travel records, the name was changed to Redmount before they boarded the ship. In fact, the name may have been changed even before they said farewell to the small Belarusian town of Bober.
The reason I started doing this investigation in terms of family history traces itself right back to my father. Mel was turning 90, and as he got increasingly older, he started looking backwards more in terms of what the family was all about. He always took great family pride. His father and mother before him were always very family-oriented, and he started this whole idea of the genealogy. He could talk about the family from the point where my grandfather, Joseph, arrived in the United States in 1904, 1905, that period. And there was a fairly strong family oral history as to what they did in New York, and then when they went to Lakewood, Pennsylvania, and all of that sort of stuff. But there was always this gap in terms of understanding what was the family like prior to coming to America. Why did they come to America? Who were they in this small town? And how do you go from this small town in Belarus all the way to New York? There was this black hole called Belarus that he couldn't get information out of, and that's where the family was from. This small town called Bober in Belarus. That at some point you had to go visit there in order to get the information we needed. And he was not able, he was far too old, and for years and years it was impossible to go because the visa restrictions were very strong. Well, that loosened up not too long ago, and I decided to take that opportunity and found friends who were going to help facilitate that for me, actually be my guide as I went there. Through my company, I reached out to the counterpart to my company, OMD, in Minsk, and was able to get contacts there. The people who were most helpful in terms of getting me to initiate the trip, there was a woman at work who was in research. Her name was Veronica. I always thought she was Russian. As it turns out, we were at a conference together, and I find out she's not Russian, she's Belarusian. And so when I mentioned my family heritage, and I said I'd always wanted to go to Belarus, but you know, it's difficult, visa, all that problem, she said, well, just do it. And so I made an offer with her that I would pay for her to fly back to Minsk, which was her hometown, if she would agree to be my guide for a week or whatever amount of time she could spare. The other people who helped make all this happen, and credit to them, kudos to everyone at OMD Minsk. Vladimir was very much the guy who decided to take this on as a project to show me what the heritage of Belarus was all about and to make sure that I could actually get out to the town of Bober and to make sure I was entertained while in Minsk and I understood what the culture was all about. Vyacheslav, who runs the office, he was also very instrumental in this, and his English was not as good, so I give him a lot of credit. They were so generous with their time. There was a time I went out to Bober, and Anatoly and his wife Christina drove me out there, and they were the ones who were doing the interviews on the street of people who we just casually met in the town of Bober.
Это того слышно. Но там я не знаю. Сохранились что-нибудь старое. Остались люди.
They were the ones who had no qualms about knocking on doors and seeing if I could get in. So I give a lot of credit to them. Just so many people in that office were very instrumental in helping me see what the world of Belarus was about. On the first week that I was there, one of the goals was to get out to Bober, to actually be on the streets, walk the area of the town, find out as much as I could, and ideally find references to the Oxyansov name. It's by actually going to the town, walking the same streets that I knew my grandfather would have walked. So Veronica was very instrumental in getting me out there for the first time. And she and I were dropped off at the entrance to the town. And we walked across the town square, we walked across the bridge that is across the Bober River, and we basically just walked around at random. Took lots of pictures, saw what the town looked like, and there were farmhouses. They were all small, they were painted in these odd colors of reds and blues and greens and yellows with very sort of ramshackle fences in front of them. Very small, very poor town, not a lot of action. In fact, we were walking around, it was probably about midday, and there was almost nobody on the streets. We were taking pictures, for example, of the hospital that's right near the opening square. An administrator came out and was very suspicious. "What are you doing?" Stopped that immediately. When the doctor who runs the hospital came out, she was much more cordial but guarded, and we talked a bit, and she informed us there's no Jewish people in this town anymore. That community was long gone since World War II. There really wasn't any information you were going to find. So we were pretty much ready to give up. We'd seen what Bober was. I had walked the streets. As we're walking out, heading on our way, this black Audi pulls up. The guy rolls down the window and talks to me in Belarusian. And of course, I don't know Belarusian. I wave Veronica over, and she tells me, as she translates, that he recognized me as having a nice Jewish face, and what is this Jewish guy doing in the town of Bober? Edek Gorchakov, by the way, introduces himself then as being the last Jewish resident of Bober. He doesn't actually live in Bober full time. He lives in Israel, but comes to Bober for 3 weeks out of the year. Total coincidence that he happened to see us as we were leaving. He's driving up. So what he does, he invites us into the car and proceeds to drive us around the town, showing us where there were 2 synagogues back in the day, and he shows us where both those synagogues were. One was the Lithuanian synagogue, the Litvak synagogue. The other one was the other Orthodox synagogue. He took us across the bridge, but said that bridge was there in the 1990s, but back in the day when your grandfather would have been here, the bridge was over, and he takes us to another location. The river there is an island, and there was a windmill on that island. So that's part of the thing here. The windmill is no longer here, of course. The bridge is just this one piece now, but this is where Joseph and others would have known to cross the river. He took us to the cemetery, which was on the edge of town. And as we were walking around the cemetery, he shared with us how the cemetery was actually divided into 3 sections. There's the front section, which had no stones in it whatsoever, and he said this is where the children were buried. And the reason there were no stones was because it was to protect them from the evil eye and other Jewish demons from back in the day when those stories were told. There was the next section of the cemetery, which is where the newer stones were, and he said this is where his family was, and some of the last Jews to live in this town were buried there. And then there was the back section, and he said this is what your grandfather would have known as the cemetery. The stones were all broken and ramshackle and in bad repair, and sometimes the stones were flat on the ground, and much of it had been destroyed, frankly, when the Nazis had come through and destroyed the town of Bober. As it started to rain, we got back in the car. He drove us then to another section out on the outside of town, and this was where there was a memorial. Back in 1941, as the Germans swept into town, they took what was then the entire Jewish population, 961 Jewish residents, marched them to the edge of town and shot them. So they were all killed. That was the end of the Jewish population in the town. The memorial was put up only recently. He was responsible for much of that, Edek Gorchakov was. And so there's a fence around it. It's a very solemn place. It has the signage on it that says that 961 Jews were killed on this spot. After Edek had taken us around, it was getting a little later in the evening, Veronica and I we were tired, and we determined that we weren't going to find out much more there on the streets of Bober. The next stop for us was indeed the archives. And there are 2 archives. One is the National Archive, which is in their large National Museum, and then there's a smaller one, which is the Minsk Archives. When you first go in, you're greeted a little bit with suspicion. Why are you there? We need to know who you are. They need to know all the background, very much the bureaucracy sense. Get past those opening guards, however, and wonderful things happen. The people in the library themselves tend to be researchers, and they all want to hear the stories, and they want to know what it is that you're looking for, and they want to help you and give you advice. So what happens is that you go in, you explain what it is that you're looking for. And so, for example, we were interested in Bober, and the key years were maybe 1880 to 1905. Is there anything like that? And they send you to what essentially would be like the card catalog, and you write down on a piece of paper what it is that you want in as much detail as you can. Then you have to go away. You have to come back in 2 or 3 days. And what comes back for you after those 2 or 3 days is you sit down and they have a pile of books. So there were lots of records in terms of census information, in terms of all the transactions that may have occurred. So there was paperwork for everything. But then the war came, and 90% of Minsk was destroyed by the Germans or by the Soviets coming back and reclaiming Minsk back in the day. And so most of the records were indeed destroyed. The ones that did survive, though, they keep very good care of, under the guise that this is indeed their history, and they take great pride in that. You end up sitting down, and there's almost a religious sense when you first get the books and you're looking at them and saying, wow, these are from the 1880s, 1890s. And you start to go through and you start turning the pages, and what you're doing, and of course they're very difficult, they don't give up their secrets easily. All of the census data, for example, is page after page are identical because it was the same form that the same census taker had to take from town to town. And you can imagine the census taker on horseback, writing down all the detail, filling in the blanks essentially, checking off the boxes he had to check, going from person to person, town to town. And so as an archivist, you're looking through and you're going through these pages and they all look so similar. It's all in Cyrillic, of course, so that's part of the challenge. And the writing is often not good. Writing with a fountain pen from horseback, you can imagine what it must have been. And so you go through, you look for the town name, because they've got them all classified together, you start looking for names, something you might recognize. So I was looking for the Aksyantsov name in Cyrillic wherever I could find it, not even knowing exactly how it would be spelled. There was another name that was important, Jerusalemchik, which was part of the family as well, both married into the Aksyantsov family, but also close friends to the Aksyantsov family. If I could find the Jerusalemchik name, that would be successful for me also. So I'm looking through page by page, and what happens is that as you go through this, you start to realize that the great sameness takes over. You realize that you've looked at the last 10, 14 pages, and maybe you weren't looking carefully enough. You were getting sort of that hypnosis that kicks in. And then something amazing happens. I mean, all these chances are against you. But then as I turned the page, I recognized a name. Now, it wasn't Aksyantsov. It wasn't Jerusalemchik. It was the name Gerchikov, the same as Edek Gerchikov, who I had met several days earlier in Bober. So I wrote down the name, recognized the street it was on, Tvercheskaya Street, wrote that down, number 38 Tvercheskaya Street, and took down the details of the home, thinking when I go back to Bober, I'll meet up with Edek again, I can at least tell them I found perhaps a relative of his in the archives. Then I turned the page and I realized the name that I'm looking at is Jerusalemchik. It was the first connection I found that I could identify as, this is family. That's kind of a neat thing. You get that sense of, wow, all of these hours were worth it. So I'm writing down, it's Chaim Jerusalemchik, living at number 20 Tvercheskaya Street. The house was divided into 2 sections, apparently, which was unusual unto itself because it's a relatively small house. On one side was the man, Chaim, his wife, and 2 daughters, identified as children. On the other side of the house were 2 grown women, which interesting unto itself, I suppose, but what I made the connection with was I was wondering, perhaps, because when Joseph came over in 1904, 1905, he came over with his 4 sisters. The oldest sister, Sorbelia, stayed and was part of the family. The youngest sister, who was Anna, or Haika, she also stayed and married a Jerusalemchik. But the 2 middle daughters, for whatever reason, we still don't know why, in the 1920s, went back to Bober. We had since lost track of them over the years. There were letters that were sent back and forth, but they were never heard from again, essentially. So Tzippa and Devora My father's aunts went back. Now, at the time, many of the Jews were told, well, it's after the Russian Revolution, Russia's better now, it's much better for the Jews, come back, everything will be fine. There might have been financial opportunities, there might have been family connections, or they might have been running away from something on the Lower East Side. We honestly don't know what. It was probably very hard living on the Lower East Side at the time. But they went back to Bober and we lost track of them. And now I'm seeing that there are these two women living in an apartment carved out of one side of a house. Could it be them? Is it a stretch? I don't know. That's sort of a historian's quandary of, do you make that leap of faith? So took notes, took down all the detail. There were other Jerusalemchiks though. That was interesting. As I kept turning the pages, I kept finding more of them. There's an interesting aspect to the name Jerusalemchik. Back in the early 1800s and even all the way to the mid 1800s, the Jews in that area of the world did not have last names. There was a first name and what was known as the patronymic. So if it was Chaim, son of Abram, it was Chaim Abramovich. But there was no last name. The census taker, however, that guy on horseback with the fountain pen who needed all that information taken down, had a space that had to have a last name in it. So you can imagine what happened. He would talk to this one Jewish guy in front of the farmhouse and say, I need your name. And when there was no last name forthcoming, sorry, I need a last name. What was interesting about Bober was that the name Jerusalemchik was originally a derogatory term. It was what the Christians called the Jews, Jerusalem being the city and Chik meaning from there, but Jerusalemchik was derogatory. It was a way to tease, maybe even worse, who knows. And so in this weird inversion that is all Jewish humor throughout the ages, when that census taker needed a last name, this one farmer said, Jerusalemchik. Probably this was the funniest thing, and it was just so funny to tease the guy on horseback. They went to the guy on horseback would go, the census taker would go to the next farmhouse, needing a last name. That guy liked the joke, he said Jerusalemchik. So you can imagine the quandary that this census taker was in. He knows that they can't all be related, but they're all giving the name Jerusalemchik. Now what's interesting about this humor is that it only happened in the town of Bober. So on the one hand, that's a wonderful anecdote about how strange Jewish humor is, but on the other hand, it's a historian's delight. If you come across the name Jerusalemchik, they had to have lived in Bober at some point. And if you knew anything about Bober, you knew at least one Jerusalemchik. But the problem was they weren't related. They were neighbors. They just all called themselves that same funny name for the Jewish population. In that respect, when you came across a name Jerusalemchik in the archives, are they related? Are they not related? We honestly don't know. So there was the Jerusalemchik, Chaim Jerusalemchik at 20 Tvercheskaya Street. Go a little bit further down as you turn the pages, and in Ploshad Svoboda, which was the big open square that we had crossed, there was another house owned by a Jerusalemchik. This time it was a woman, but the house was empty, but still owned by this woman named Jerusalemchik. And so we found several cases of Jerusalemchik. I even found cases in the other archives of Jerusalemchiks going back to as far back as probably 1810, 1820. So part of the premise was that as we said goodbye to Edek, we knew that we would be back. And having been to the archives and now armed with this information of recognizing the street names, and we knew where the synagogues were based on what Edek had showed us before, it would be interesting to put those pieces together. Let's go find where 20 Tvercheskaya Street was and see, is it near the synagogue? Sure enough, it was. Tvercheskaya Street runs right into Ploshad Svoboda, and it was the corner of where the street intersects, which is where the Lithuanian synagogue would have been, the Litvak synagogue. We then went directly to the house that was number 20. And we then took lots and lots of pictures. I walked over the same dirt path that I know my grandfather must have walked many, many times as they went back and forth from the synagogue or the market square. We also had an appointment to meet with Edek again. because I wanted to hear more stories about what the lore was, what the history was of the Jews in the town, and especially since there were no more Jews in the town, he would be the one person who could tell us those stories. So when we met with Edek the second time, we went into he took us graciously into his house. He showed us what the house looked like. This is what the houses would have looked like back in the day. Now I say that in that respect because none of the houses are original. Any house you go into has been rebuilt. What happened was during World War II, when the Germans swept through, they burned down most of the farmhouses. And the ones that they didn't burn down on their way in, they burned down on their way out. So nothing was truly original. But the houses got rebuilt because when people moved back into the town, lumber was very cheap, it was all around, and it was easy to rebuild the houses that they knew. I had mentioned then that I had found in that same archives, the next page over, a reference to Jerusalemchik, to Chaim Jerusalemchik, and they lived at 20, Tvercheskaya, and that they had the divided house and that there were the two women who lived there along with the family with the two girls. And it was then that Edek made a connection that's very important from a historical perspective. He said, yes, his mother told stories of the two women who lived down the street who came from America. Now, everything prior to that had been theoretical, almost academic. We tried to piece it together and say, this is Devorah and Sippa, Mel's aunts, Joseph's sisters. But there's no proof of that. That's a leap in faith. But now we had a man saying that his mother remembered the two women from America who lived down the street.
Я не знаю, как вы переведете, чувствовали любовь, хотя на 1% к бобру, как у меня. Но я думаю, что это не получится.
One of the challenges we had as we talked with Edek Gerchikov was about what was it that the Redmounts, the Oxyansovs, what did they do for a living? And as we told more about what we knew, that he was educated, Joseph was educated, that he spoke multiple languages, Edek helped us understand that probably this was not a man who was working in the alcohol refinery, not a man who was working in the lumberyard or doing basic farm work. These were educated Jews. He was traveling around. They were probably merchants, going from city to city, going from place to place. In fact, further evidence of this, a bit anecdotal but fun nonetheless, I learned over the years that Joseph had a taste for a drink, an odd sort of plum brandy that we call slivovitz. Now, what's interesting about slivovitz is when I asked my hosts when I went to Belarus whether they liked slivovitz, they really didn't know what I was talking about. They kind of heard about it. They knew it was some sort of liqueur or brandy, but they had never had it. It wasn't something that was popular in Minsk or in the towns or cities of Belarus. What that implies is that Joseph would have only gotten his taste for slivovitz in taverns and bars in places in Poland or Lithuania or Serbia or places as he traveled around. It was not a local thing. So that's further evidence that he was indeed a traveler and making his trade on the road. And I also question whether the name Redmount, the name Oxyansov, what was the interconnection there? The name Redmount may have actually existed long before they got on the boat and headed across the Atlantic to New York. In fact, the name Oxyansov may even be a made-up name. As we talked to people like Edek Gerchikov and talked to others who knew the history of the Jews in Belarus, the name Oxyansov meant nothing. In fact, it didn't even sound like a Jewish name. That language came up a lot. Now, one of the things that you have to recognize is we talked with Edek Gerchikov and we said, why would people leave Bober back in the day? One of the things that he cited very strongly was that the big fear was the Russian army, getting conscripted into the Russian army as a young man. After the census takers came through, the next wave to come through would indeed be the army, and they would come and they would take the oldest Jewish boy, convert him on the spot, sweep him away into the army because you couldn't be Jewish and be in the army. The big fear was that if you got taken away, you would never be seen again. So it may well be that Joseph and family left Bober, not because of any persecution of Jews, but because of the need to escape the army. Now, here's where the interesting thing about the name comes into place. Joseph was a merchant. Joseph traveled from city to city. He was familiar with places like Odessa, like Smolensk, like Berlin. He had been around. He spoke several languages. He spoke Polish, Lithuanian. Yes, he spoke Greek and Latin, but those were the things that he learned in school as an educated Jew. But those other language he would have picked up on the road. He would have picked up by meeting Lithuanians, by meeting Poles, by speaking with Russians. So the fact that he was so fluent in that points to the fact that here was a merchant traveling from city to city. It may not have been good for him to be readily identified as a Jew and not having a history of being in the army. One of the theories then is that the name Aksyansov was made up so that it wouldn't appear that he was a Jew from Bober, probably with the name Jerusalemchik. So the name Aksyansov may even have been made up. Take that one step further, the name Redmount would have even isolated him further from the fact that he should have been conscripted into the Russian army, because you can go around with the name Redmount and nobody will assume you're Russian, maybe. Mel was always a family guy. This sense of family was hugely important to him. When he saw the narrative that I had written after being in Belarus, he was very moved. He was very touched by it. And Mel was not a man who expressed emotion at all. And so for him to share that, it was like one of maybe a handful of times in my life that I can remember him conveying that sense of gratitude or pleasure or something of that nature for something that I had done on his behalf. But even more important for Mel was the idea that he was able to then fill in the gap on his father. The idea that we now know more about Joseph than we did before, and that a lot of it might be just surmising on our part, maybe things that we can't actually track down. We'll have to do more research, go back to Belarus perhaps at some point. But Joseph would have liked the idea that his liking for Slivovitz becomes an important part of the storyline, or that this odd twist on Jewish humor, that the name comes from just Jews tweaking the guy who was the low-level government official who must have been exasperated at hearing the name Jerusalemchik over and over, and that we can relish in that. To that, I think that we have a very strong heritage in terms of the family, where Joseph would have liked that twist on Jewish humor, would have liked the idea that we're sitting around a table and drinking Slivovitz in his honor, and we'll raise one more glass in honor of Mel as well.